Hello, beer enthusiasts. Do you really know how to brew not just good beer, but great beer? Well, hold on to your pint glasses because you're in for a real treat. Because in today's video, we're going one-on-one with none other than Dr. Chris White. He's the mastermind behind many of the yeasts that have created some of the finest craft beers. We're going to dive deep into the art and science of yeast. We may even uncover a few secrets that change the way you look at brewing and fermentation. And you might even be surprised at some of Chris's amazing pro tips. So if you're eager to level up your brewing game, then stick around as we're going to uncover some surprising truths behind yeast and what makes outstanding beer. And trust me, you're going to want to watch to the very end because that's where Chris shares some of his very best pro tips, some of which might be quite a surprise to you. So let's dive right into the video. Hey, I'm at the 2023 Homebrew Con, and look who I bumped into, none other than Dr. Chris White. And we've been trying to get together for a long time. We ran into each other at several events, and it just seems like schedules didn't come together, but this time it did. And I just can't wait to jump into some of the questions. So these were questions that you had, and so we're going to talk to Chris about those. So the first thing, Chris, seems like a burning topic for you, a very popular guest in my audience opinion. So when you're brewing with yeast in general, and so let's keep it broad, not just wet yeast and not just dry yeast. Are there some tips that you would recommend home brewers and pro brewers to always keep in mind? And it might even be something kind of new that you've recently discovered.
Well, thanks, Doug, and your audience. I'm happy to talk to you here near my home in San Diego, California. Happy to have the Homebrew Con back here since first time since 2011, I believe.
Yeah.
And some things have changed greatly, and some things haven't with yeast because we've been brewing beer for a very long time as humans. And so the first thing is, you could make beer very easily with yeast and do almost nothing. And yeast is going to do its thing. It's going to consume the sugars, make alcohol, make flavors. But most people today are interested in making the best beer possible, right? That's what I was doing in my home brewing. That's why people are listening to your show and collaborating together, because beer is actually a very hard thing to make great. When we have classes with professional brewers at White Labs, we have some classrooms. That's one thing I ask them sometimes, like, everybody wants to make great beer. So why don't we?
Ooh, that's right? Profound.
Sort of it kind of wakes some ideas up, because you not only are you making beer at home, and a lot of people in the audience, you're also drinking a lot of craft beer probably, and not every beer is great. I mean, that's just like a foregone conclusion. But every brewer wants to make great beer, and I think the main thing is it isn't easy.
Now, Denny Kahn would argue with you.
Well, it's easy just to do it, but to get a great tasting beer, especially commercially, where you got to make it again and again and again and again, okay. I think that's where it gets actually quite difficult.
It's great versus good.
Yeah, and exactly. And my quest in home brewing was to stop. I mean, everything I was making, I didn't really like, but people were drinking it. This is early '90s, including my parents, which kind of kept me going. But then I met Yusuf Cherney, who had ended up being part of Ballast Point, but was a home brew mart at the time in the early 90s. And we started home brewing together. And that's what really changed my home brewing. But you see, he was into all the hard work. He was a philosophy major at UCSD, and that's kind of where we met. But he wanted to learn everything about yeast. There are new brewers today who want to run from yeast and just do it easy. Well, okay, but you only have 3 ingredients, right? Yeast, malt, and hops. And they aren't the same. If you ever hear anybody use the word the same, to me, that's a really red flag for, it's not true, right? We could say that about every beer you're drinking, every beer available here, every beer on a big tap list. And don't fall in that trap of the same. Otherwise, you lose your quest to make it great. And on the yeast side, for many, and still what the dominant talk is about how much. And I think that's just because it's one of the easiest things to measure, even though a lot of people don't use a microscope. For those of you who do, or weight and things like that, you can measure. And when I started White Labs in 1995, we wanted a pitchable batch of yeast, which was actually hard to make, and so that's why WLP still stands for White Labs Pitchable. And now there's a lot. Most yeast companies are selling higher amounts, and then even pushing higher amounts than us, and then we react and make higher amounts. But that was an innovation at the time, and you had to have a starter before that because you didn't have enough yeast to make a 5-gallon batch. You weren't in the millions of cells per mil range. You were in the hundreds of thousands of cells per mil range. But the word never went away because home brewers like to optimize, trying to make the best beer possible. So even pushing more yeast than ever used before. But there are other things too. Oxygen allows yeast to grow. Zinc allows yeast to be fully healthy. And those two things are much harder to measure. And there's now debates, again, wet or dry, do you use oxygen or not? I've been working on this a long time, and I think that's an unnecessary discussion, actually. Yes, if you want to make it easy, just don't add oxygen. You don't have to add oxygen if it's liquid yeast either, or dry. It doesn't matter. It's going to do its thing. But are you trying to make the best beer possible? Because no matter how much yeast you add, this goes back to, okay, how much should we add? People get really into, should it be this amount or this amount? But remember, all yeast has to grow in your beer.
Okay.
There's no amount that's just the amount. Whatever amount you're adding, yeast grow. That's how we make the ethanol, CO2, and flavor compounds and aroma compounds. So it must grow. And how is it going to grow best? It's going to grow best, not just what you started with, but if the oxygen is there for the cell to make a nice new plump cell, and the zinc is there for all the enzymes that are zinc dependent, including alcohol dehydrogenase, to make the right flavor compounds. And so that's just, I just, for the main tip I like to think about is, think about pitching rate, think about oxygen, think about zinc. And these are things that, they're not new things.
Right.
But they keep getting rediscovered. Vinny Salurzo, owner of Russian River Brewery, very famous for his Pliny Younger, started out in the San Diego region, not far from here.
Yeah.
And now up in Northern California. He gave a talk recently at the California Craft Brewers Association in Sacramento, along with Sierra Nevada, about hop creep in dry hopping, which everything's dry hop today, right? Almost. It's just like dry hopping is way more of a thing than it used to be, and there's a lot more hops and varieties being made in different kilning temperatures. And so they started out with saying, okay, Pliny is a 28. Pliny the Elder is a 28-day beer because giving time for post-dry hopping, settling and whatever, and creep, because you don't want the creep to happen in a package. And they were able to reduce it to 16 days by a couple things. One of those things was yeast health.
That's almost half.
Yeah.
I did that in my head.
And yeast health, it's like, okay, they're pretty good brewers, right? Yeah. They have pretty healthy yeast.
Yeah.
But they weren't adding, they weren't optimized in zinc. Because who measures it? Nobody in the past, but now we can. White Labs test it for breweries too now. And people are adding mineral zinc in the whirlpool or kettle, or it's all gone. It's all gone. Nothing transfers over because it's called chelation. It sticks. Zinc will stick to metal. Zinc is metal. Will stick to proteins.
Okay.
And what are you doing in your whirlpool? Pulling out proteins.
Yes.
So it's all at the bottom. So it's a waste of money, and that's why 20 years ago we released Cervomyces that was yeast grown in the presence of very high concentrations of zinc. We're not the only ones selling it anymore, but we helped create it, because that protected the zinc inside the yeast, dead yeast, but to go over to the fermentation. But there's another way to do it, because not everybody uses Cervomyces. Maybe it's expensive. I don't know. But a lot of people do, but a lot of people don't. So you can also add zinc on the cold side. What else do you add on the cold side? Yeast.
But how do you know how much? So
at the same time you pitch yeast. Well, it's kind of new. I mean, it's been talked about in lots of different circles.
Yeah.
I'm sure some people are doing it. It's not like this is the first time it's talked about. Jamil Zanishev, my co-author of the yeast book, had started that at Heretic and was just like shocked at the difference of his yeast health, which affects final gravity, which affects making high gravity beers with high alcohol beers with low esters. It affects hop creep.
Okay.
And so that's the next exploration, is really optimizing a process for people, even on the home scale, to be doing that.
There's almost an analogy to this. Happy wife, happy life is what I've always been doing. It almost sounds like there's a yeast equivalent to that to get that great beer.
Yes. Again, yeast are going to do it regardless because they're going to consume sugars.
Yep.
We eat regardless if it's great food or, I don't know, microwave mac and cheese. But our body might react a little better to a really nutritious meal.
And therefore have more energy,
yes.
more stamina, all these things. So, I mean, it's very similar to, okay, if you're going to exercise, you need the right foods and the right ingredients and oxygen.
Right. Because, we're feeding our cells and we're feeding all the other non-human cells, all the biome and microbiome inside of us, which is more DNA than our own DNA, which is an incredible thing to think of. So we're feeding a lot through our diet. Yeast are just feeding their cells, but it's still a complex nutrient requirement. And something as small and weird as zinc can have such an impact on brewers' yeast, particularly because they're in this ethanol cycle. If just yeast are out in the wild, maybe doing aerobic fermentation, they're not doing as much of the requirements for the alcohol dehydrogenase, but brewers' yeast and fermentation are doing all of that. So the zinc concentration becomes even more important.
So do you know how, if you had a 5-gallon batch, how much zinc do you add?
Well, you want to finish at 0.3 to 0.5 ppm.
Okay.
So it depends if you're using zinc heptahydrate or different zinc salts. And I think we'll just have to do some studies there to give homebrewers, or put some processes together for homebrewers to do it.
I remember...
and I'm sure they already exist. People have probably been doing it on the homebrew scale too.
Well, I remember you have a yeast nutrient that you guys sell. Is that sufficient?
So the yeast nutrient, Cervomyces, is solves all of that. It gives you 0.5 when you use that what we have for 5 gallons, 20 liters of beer. Our other nutrients are great, but they have zinc in them usually, but our main one has zinc, but it goes in the whirlpool. Okay. So the zinc part just disappears.
Oh, so that's the trick. Well, it sounds like some of these things that you're learning were unexpected for you. What else is changing in a world of CRISPRs modifying yeast and now thiol enhancing yeast? What has surprised you lately?
Well, I guess one of the questions that have been around since I started, again, not a new question, but from day one, when is GMO yeast going to happen? Because even before White Labs, I was doing GMO work on yeast for more human issues, working on blood coagulation myself. So in the food sector, it's a much different discussion, right? And the United States is pretty open to GMO. We have a lot of GMO in our food chain. But Australia, New Zealand, tries to be zero. A lot of Europe is anti-GMO. And beer is this global thing. So the big breweries have just said, well, you know what, we don't want GMO. We don't want the backlash. Whether you're for it or against it or neutral,
right?
As a commercial company, they do make some marketing mistakes once in a while. This is one that they had on their radar and said, let's just not do it. There's no real huge benefit.
Okay.
It's not solving a like on the pharmaceutical side, solving some disease that's going to save lives. It's just about making something faster or flavor different or whatever. So they didn't want that risk. So there's no GMO barley, no GMO hops, no GMO yeast until very recent times. And I'm a little surprised how quickly GMO yeast has come into the play with some companies making it. And that's fine. We'll make some too. I think the only thing what I like to talk about is, again, not some new idea for me, something old, a big brewery's concern. And we're almost setting a trap for ourselves as small breweries by not knowing what we're doing. So a lot of breweries are buying GMO yeast, and maybe home brewers. That's fine, you're drinking your own beer. And again, not saying it's right or wrong, but say a commercial brewery buys a pitch of yeast, it's not communicated that it's GMO, or it's GMO here, not GMO here, but it's GMO in Australia or New Zealand, because every country, Canada, every country has different definitions, unfortunately. So selling a beer, exporting it to Australia or New Zealand can be illegal for that country to import it.
Oh, wow.
But it's happening today because really we just don't know. If you asked a brewer, hey, was that GMO? They would say, I don't know. So I just think we have to do a little bit better job of being transparent. So if we make it, we're going to tell the brewer, hey, this is GMO. Please tell your customer. Not because it's a warning, just because somebody's going to get pissed off.
Oh, yeah.
That is very negative to it. And you don't want the craft brewing industry being looked at like Monsanto or something. Think about that name. Very negative, right? And I'm just being, of course, a little exaggerating that a little bit, but I care about craft beer and I care about our industry. And so there's some cool benefits. There's some non-GMO methods, but some countries call those still GMO, like you've altered the DNA. So I would encourage, especially on the commercial scale, just to do some research because we haven't really educated ourselves, because the food and beverage industry has prevented things being come on the label, which is okay, but we're not the rest of the food and beverage industry. We're craft brewing. You care about where your beer is made. You don't care where your macaroni and cheese was made. We have some small producers. But we're really into transparency, and I just want that to continue with every new yeast innovation.
Well, I like that. The transparency is essential. And it's interesting that you mentioned that, because I keep hearing thiol enhanced yeasts, but nobody says GMO.
Yep.
But you're saying it is.
It can
in
be.
most cases.
In most cases.
Yeah.
And there's hybridization methods. There's other things that hybridization, just put two yeast cells next to each other, hope they mate. It can happen, and there's some techniques like that. And that's much more like classical.
Yeah.
That's not GMO in any country. When you open up a cell and cut some DNA and put some other DNA in, that's where you get into the discussion. Did you do CRISPR? Okay. Did you just increase the copy number of a gene in the United States that wouldn't be GMO because it's its own DNA? In a lot of other countries, that's still GMO because you cut the DNA. So it's complex, and again, I'm not taking sides on it. I'm just saying there's some people, really passionate people on the negatives, saying the negative side, and they want beer to tell them what it is.
So any yeast right now you're really excited about?
Oh yeah, there's always new strains. I mean, there is so much more we don't know yet. There's so much more that brewers are creating every day. When Jamil and I wrote the yeast book in 2010, I mean, think about what's all changed since then.
Yeah.
I made a game on brewing in 2001. It didn't even have IPAs in it. So, and in 2010, we weren't even talking about sour beers or, of course, hazies, but sour beers came up and going down a little bit in terms of, it'll never go away, but just a popularity that was leading to high sales. But we have one of the guys at White Labs that works there, is a passionate home brewer, and he likes making sours. That's his thing. It'll never go away.
Yep.
For people that like doing it, but it's just not as popular as it once was. We're selling less bacteria and wild yeast. People are making more hazies. They want the big thiol contribution, and so we released a sort of a mix, a blend, Tropical yeast to have our highest thiol producing strains in a blend. ones you wouldn't normally think of to make an IPA. So that was our kind of non-GMO Thiol strain. And again, we'll have some GMO ones in the future. I mean, it goes that way, it goes that way. But we just want to tell people if we do. That's all.
So speaking of IPAs, Vinny Chirluzzo was recently on my program, and we were talking about double dry hopping. And he was telling a little bit of a history of Pliny and the beginnings of the brewery. And your name came up several times. Yeah. And he said, can you share a little bit more about the yeast that you were providing Vinny in the early days? Because he said it looked like a drug deal that he'd pull up in a parking lot with a bag full of money, and you'd hand him a brown bag full of stuff. Yeah. Can you share that story?
Yeah, that was a funny story because he was living in Temecula, grew up on a family winery, and that's about an hour north of here. And I was at University of California, San Diego, about 15 minutes from here. White Labs is still located near the UC San Diego, and I still live near UC San Diego. And so he would drive down, and there was no cell phones at that time. It wasn't that long ago, right? But in the early 90s, no cell phones. So he would get to the gas station at the bottom of the hill from the university and call me from a payphone. I'd walk down from the 4th floor of the Basic Science Building, BSB, and meet him in the parking lot. And we didn't think much of it. I'd give him the yeast. He'd give me the money.
The brown paper bags, the way he described it.
Pretty much. And I'd go back and work on my yeast manipulation stuff on the research side. So, but what happened was, you get a little busy when you're brewing beer. This is the Blind Pig Brewery, which he still has one of the names for one of his IPAs.
Yeah.
And he started sending his sales guy that was coming down here to deliver beer to come pick it up. And that's where the sales guy was like, no. This feels like a drug deal. And that's where we both went, I don't know, we were just sort of used to this. But to describe it to, you're going to call him from the payphone, to use here's an ATM card, get some cash. And so he did it.
Yeah.
He just made us realize that it was kind of weird.
Yeah. Looked suspicious.
Yep.
Well, I have to ask about the yeast. Do you still, the yeast that Vinny had, are you still producing it, and is that the yeast that he uses as Pliny?
Yeah, California Ale yeast was the first strain. It was the strain I used in my home brewing. I was collecting lots of yeast strains there that would end up becoming our yeast bank. And I was doing trips to Europe and different yeast banks in Denmark and Belgium and Germany and UK, talking to brewers. But really, even before I was thinking yeast company, just to make my great homebrew, and the guys that I was homebrewing with would again start Ballast Point. So we were kind of creating some different recipes with them. So at the same, out of our homebrewing came Ballast Point and White Labs, and great beers, and then great yeast to make the great beers. But it was about passion. It wasn't about sitting around talking about starting companies. It was sitting around talking about how to make great beer. So California Ale yeast was that strain. Strain that you still use today, still our top-selling yeast. So that's kind of cool that with all these styles we talked about, all these different things that have happened in yeast. We make over 85 different yeast strains every single week right now in all these different amounts. California Ale yeast is still the number one strain for us, which I like. I think it's important because it's such a big core strain. We're not just a specialty yeast producer.
Well, I thought it was really interesting. I was lucky enough to get a kind of behind-the-scenes tour from the brewer at Sierra Nevada. And I kept asking, what yeast do you use in this? And what yeast do you use in this? Well, you know what his answer was ultimately. He said, the only yeast we use primarily is the Chico strain. That's it.
Yeah, and there's different versions of that out there. We did a big study that was published in Cell in 2016 with 157 different yeast strains. And in that study, we put in some different versions of Chico out there, and they're genetically different. So our California yeast, I think, is Its genetic is unique, and it's also unique in some brewing properties. And again, that might hit to the point of, oh, it's the same. It's the same. They're genetically different, and I think ours is pretty cool. And it's what I liked in our brewing. It's a little more flocculent than other versions with some of the DNA in the flocculation area. It's clean, and to this day, when I order a White Labs beer, because we've had our own breweries for 10 years, have the tap room in North Carolina and San Diego.
I love those.
And we're just showcasing what yeast does to the public. I generally order beers with California ale yeast. We have some beer on tap here at our booth. I'd love for you to come over and try after this.
Yeah. So does it go back to the point, though, you were talking about there's a difference between good beer and great beer. And I've always heard, get to know a yeast like it's a friend, so that you can predict it and you know it. You know what it needs to be healthy. You know all these things before you start experimenting with a whole bunch of other yeasts. Do you recommend that?
Oh, yeah. I mean, we use our whole catalog, so our brewers are always using different yeasts. But the best way to work with yeast is getting to know it like your pets. I mean, say you have 2 dogs. Say you have 2 cats from the same litter.
Yep.
Say you have 2 daughters, 2 sons, a brother, son. They're different, right?
Yep.
And you get to know them and know their uniqueness. And yeast is no different. It has a set of DNA that's different than a different cell. And don't expect it to be the same. I have an identical twin brother, so we are unusual in that we have the same DNA. But a lot of people have fraternal twins. And I do a lot of coaching on this too. It doesn't really work because people don't know what I'm talking about. But people expect fraternal twins to be the same.
Yep.
Because the word is twin. Sorry, it's a bad word. They're brothers and sisters born on the same day. Same DNA difference like any other brothers and sisters. A super closeness from being born on the same day and growing up together, spending that time in the womb. It's a long time. But most parents of fraternal twins, and there's a bunch probably in your audience, use the word the same a lot. Oh, they don't do this the same. Oh, they don't do the same. They put this unreasonable expectation on fraternal twins to be the same.
Yep.
And that's a lot of pressure. And I'd like us to think about the DNA a little bit. Identical twins don't have to be asked to be the same. We're the same. Growing up differently, or we're different people. Me and my brother are different. And yeast are kind of like this. I mean, California ale yeast is the same DNA. It clones itself. 002, 005, these different yeast strains we have. Once they're in your beer, they'll be the same. But the strains themselves are different. And love that difference. Don't expect them to be the same. Enjoy that difference. Learn that difference.
Well, as we wrap up, last question. So how would you summarize your best tips for yeast in general for home brewers, for pro brewers? What are your tips that you've learned in all these years, but if you had to boil it down to a small handful, what would those be?
I think one of the things is making the beer you're trying to make as dry as possible. Now, you're maybe making a barley wine that's going to have a certain residual gravity. That's great, but don't leave it higher than what you wanted. I think the most award-winning beers, you hit a certain final gravity. Even 1 Plato higher can make a beer not taste as bitter or hoppy, not flocculate the same, because yeast need to get in their starvation mode before they flocculate, and the carbohydrates can block that. So the best technical beers really hit the final gravity, and I think that's one of the biggest things that makes a beer more drinkable. Or you go to a brewery and you're like, oh, these beers are all a little wordy. Bad oxygen, bad zinc. It's not the cell count. Right? That's where the cell count's important, but all yeast have to grow. That brewer's probably not pitching too little yeast. They're just not optimizing the oxygen at 10 ppm and not optimizing the zinc at 0.5 ppm.
So your metric that you would kind of track if you were brewing the same beer over and over again was, how's it hitting that final gravity? And if it's not hitting it, something's wrong and you need to look at your process.
Yes, and that's what we do at White Labs Brewing Company. When we don't hit our terminals, I know I'm not going to, I think enjoy the beer as much, and it's not going to sell as well. And I say to the brewers, what might have happened in this batch? And usually the answer is nothing different, but that's not true. You got to dig deeper because everything's different every time.
Yeah. Wow. Chris, this is fantastic, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. I hope we can do it again, maybe on a live webinar where we can get some questions. Did you consider that sometime?
I'd love to.
Good.
It's been a great conversation. I love all our conversations over time, so it's nice to capture this one on your camera.
Yeah. Well, they ask great questions. That's the fun part, because mine are not that great. Well, super. Thank you so much. Enjoy HomebrewCon, and you guys need to check it out. We've been drinking all kinds of beers and technical sessions. You doing a book signing. Did you do a technical session?
I didn't do a technical session this conference. I love doing them, so didn't happen this conference. But I did one just a couple weeks ago at a different conference in Nova Scotia. I love doing them. Hopefully next to HomebrewCon, I'll give one. But do things like this, spend all the time at the booth, talking to people about their different beers and sometimes sampling them.
All right. Well, this is the reason to come to HomebrewCon. Check it out. Cheers.
Well, there you have it, folks. I had an absolutely amazing time speaking with yeast wizard Chris White. We learned some incredible insights about what truly makes a great beer. And it wasn't exactly what I thought. Now, if you found value in this video, please give it a like and be sure to watch this next video, which you don't want to miss. Cheers!